Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Looking at Comic Books. My name's Michael, and we're actually back in the library today. We're starting to get things ready getting things ready for when we can open up, which we hope will hopefully be soon. But today I wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit about Golden Age comics and a little bit of the history of them. But before I can get to the Golden Age, I want to briefly cover the time period before the Golden Age comics. Now, there is a time period called the Platinum Age, and this period pretty much covers the first part of the 20th century. And during this time period, what you had was some of the early precursors of comics, were pretty much all they were reprints of the comics that were found in the newspapers, the funny strips. That's actually where we get the term comic book from, were books that just had reprints of the comic strips from the newspapers. And a lot of the precursors, now the first official comic book is considered to come out in 1933, and that was called Famous Funnies, A Carnival of Comics. And as I mentioned, it was pretty much just all reprints of comic strips from the newspapers. But this was during the Great Depression. This was a cheap way people could get a form of entertainment and stuff. Comics only cost a few cents. So this issue was successful. That Eastern Publishing actually went ahead and launched a series with it called Famous Funnies. I actually have an issue of it right here. This is a post-World War II issue, but this series, pretty much all it did was just do reprints of the newspaper comic strips. There was some minor new material, but it was mostly just reprints. But this series, in many ways, was also a trailblazer. It featured some of the early superheroes, predating even Superman, and had one of the first female superheroes, too. Named Invisible Scarlet O'Neil, which was a policewoman who could turn herself invisible. So in many ways, this series was very much a trailblazer in the early days of comics. Since the series was successful, others tried to jump in on the comic book bandwagon. You had another company that was called National Allied Publications, that eventually would become what we consider DC Comics, released the first of a series called More Fun Comics. Was actually the first comics series that contained nothing but completely brand new material. Nothing had been reprinted or anything like that. It was all completely brand new material. And it was actually this series that through this series, DC would eventually launch some of its big superheroes. Green Arrow, Spectre, Aquaman all first appeared in this comic series. Since the series was a success, DC started releasing other series as well. Of course, one of the series was Action Comics, and for a big story that they wanted to really try and draw people in for that first issue, they ended up buying the rights to a character called Superman from Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, two young men from Cleveland. So they ended up getting the rights to them, and then throughout the 40s, these two would be working as creators of Superman. The first issue, Action Comics #1, came out in 1938. Of course, a lot of us have seen the very iconic cover with Superman with the car over his head. The character became an instant success, and a lot of other companies started looking into producing comics with superheroes, and this is what really started the golden age of comics. Through the pre-war and during World War II, superheroes really dominated the comic book industry. There were other genres, but it was mostly superheroes. Some very well-known superheroes that are still around today came out from this time period. Of course, we have Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, but you also had Captain America, the Human Torch. There was also some lesser-known characters and superheroes you may not know about as well, such as Bullet Man, Black Terror, just to name a couple. So during World War II, superheroes really were very popular. They're very dominant. A lot of the stories and even a lot of the covers of the time period very much were, in many ways, kind of like propaganda. They were very much promoting the war effort, showing the superheroes working with soldiers or stopping Nazis who were trying to attack the United States or something like that. So while superheroes were really popular during the war, after the war, however, they actually saw a decline in popularity. And in their decline, other genres rose to the forefront. During this time period, you had jungle comics became big, you had romance, you had crime, you had horror. A lot of these other different genres became more popular. the issue with that was some of the, especially the horror and crime comics, a lot of times they also became more violent, and in many ways there was a backlash to that because while comics were viewed more towards kids, some of the content in them, a lot of people started viewing was not appropriate for kids. And during this time period, into the late 40s and early 50s, you had what has become kind of a comic book hysteria. A lot of people came to the conclusion that comic books were actually leading to were causing increases of juvenile delinquency. They got this information because they were talking to children or even students in schools and stuff who had committed crimes or had gotten in trouble, asking them if they had read comic books. If they said yes, then that proved their point that comic books led them to getting into trouble. Of course, they didn't take into account that comic books were very much was very much a big medium that a lot of kids were reading and involved with, and that a majority of the population of children at the United States at this time were reading comic books. But eventually this hysteria reached the point where it actually made it to the United States Senate. There was actually Senate hearings on comic books and whether or not they were leading to juvenile delinquency. So in order, as a way to fight back some of the negative bad press and to prevent the government from censoring them, a lot of the comic book companies got together and started the Comics Code Authority, which was going to be a regulating body that would pretty much review all the comics that were going to be coming out, and they would require changes or anything to be made if they thought the content was not appropriate for children. This kind of, in many ways, sounded the death knell for some comic book companies. When they tried to make the changes, they just couldn't make a go of it, and they ended up shutting down in the 50s. You had a lot of comic book companies that went out of business during this time period. And then getting back to towards the end of the 50s, in the middle of the 50s there, they were looking for ways, comic companies were looking for ways to revive the industry, and one of the things that DC did was decide to go back and revive some of the superheroes. So in 1956, Showcase number 4 came out, first appearance of Barry Allen as the Flash, and this is what actually would begin the Silver Age, which I will talk more about the Silver Age in the next video. But this just gives you a very brief history of what was going on in the Golden Age, and I have some Golden Age comics here for you. Talk about, as I mentioned, I do have right here a famous Funnies that came out in 1947. This was very much had different characters and stuff. A lot of these comics these days were actually anthologies. They didn't just have one story, they had multiple stories through the issues. Like for instance, this one had a story of Invisible Scarlet O'Neil, the invisible policewoman as I was telling you about. They also had other characters, other strips called them Okie Dokes and Scorchy Smith. So this was also mainly just reprinting stuff that was in newspapers from the time period. I have an example of a superhero comic from the Golden Age. Now this is also post-war. This is from 1949. Now just to do some clarification, you may recognize the character as Shazam. The character had a movie that came out not too long ago. But just to do a brief explanation, when the character first came out with Fawcett Comics, he was actually called Captain Marvel. What happened is, in the early 50s, Fawcett Comics actually lost a lawsuit that was brought by DC Comics saying that they had violated copyright, saying that Captain Marvel looked too much like Superman. DC won the lawsuit. Fawcett agreed to stop publishing the character, and actually in a short time, Fawcett stopped publishing comic books, period. In the late 60s, DC went ahead and got the rights to the character. But while they got the rights to the character, Marvel Comics, which was really big at the time, didn't want to lose out the Captain Marvel name to DC, so they went ahead and had a copyright made for the name. So while DC got the character, they did not get the name, so when the character was reintroduced by DC in the early 70s, he was instead called Shazam. But this one has, this is also an anthology. It's stories with Captain Marvel Jr., and Mary Marvel. They all team up together for one story, and each one has their own individual story in this as well. The next example I have here is of the jungle genre. Of course, it's Tarzan. Has a beautiful painted cover by Morris Golub. Um, Dell, and then later when the Dell Comics became Gold Key, they a lot of times did some of these lovely painted covers, which are just beautiful. This came out in 1954, so this would be towards more the tail end of the Golden Age period, but just a beautiful cover. And the final example I brought today is called of the funny animals genre, which would pretty much this would be your Mickey Mouse, your Donald Duck, your Bugs Bunny, something like that, with talking animals. So this is Uncle Scrooge from 1954. What makes this comic somewhat special is it was done, the art and stories were done by a creator named Carl Barks. Carl Barks was actually had originally actually worked for Disney doing some of their cartoons and stuff, had left that, got into the comic book industry, and he would oftentimes do a lot of the stories dealing with Donald Duck and his extended family. Carl Barks was actually the creator of Uncle Scrooge, and this was one of Uncle Scrooge's early appearances in comics. But it's Carl Barks was a very great artist, great storyteller. So in many ways, this was just a great issue to have. So that just kind of covers it for today, as we talked about the Golden Age. Next time we'll be looking more at the Silver Age, and it's the start of Marvel Comics, and then also the revival of superheroes. So thank you for watching. If you like this video, just go ahead and hit the like on the screen there, and I hope you have a nice day.